You're not lazy. You're not stupid. So why are you still stuck? Why does progress feel like pushing through invisible walls? Maybe it's not you. Maybe it's the assumptions you've been forced to carry, the invisible rules you never chose, but still obey. You were taught to follow logic, but it wasn't logic. It was imitation. You were told to think, but only inside a box built by people who gave up thinking long ago. In this video, we'll dismantle that box. We'll show you how Elon Musk tears down inherited thinking and rebuilds from scratch using first principles. Not to look smart, not to rebel, but to solve the problem for real. By the end of this, you won't just understand Elon's thinking, you'll begin to rebuild your own. Subscribe to Mind of Musk if you're ready to stop following logic that isn't yours, and if this wakes you up, share it. Someone else needs to break free too. You don't start with answers, you start with silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that strips you naked of every borrowed thought you've ever called your own. That's where I begin. Not with strategies, not with case studies, but with a question no one dares to ask. Why do we believe what we believe? Most people never ask that. They inherit their ideas the way they inherit eye color, blindly, obediently. And then they spend their lives optimizing assumptions that were wrong to begin with. That's how industries get built on lies. That's how smart people stay stuck. Because assumptions are invisible. They don't walk in through the front door. They hide in language, in phrases like, "That's just how it's done," or "This is the industry standard." You hear those words, and you think you're being smart by following them. You're not. You're outsourcing your thinking. I've seen billion-dollar industries operate on assumptions that collapse under a single honest question. That's why I don't trust what people say is normal. I trust physics. I trust math. I trust what doesn't flinch when you push it. When we started SpaceX, everyone said rockets had to cost hundreds of millions. I asked why. They said, because they always have. That's not a reason. That's a ritual. So I broke it. I broke it by asking what a rocket actually is. Aluminum, titanium, copper, fuel, wiring. I priced the raw materials. It turned out we could build the same rocket for a fraction of the cost, if we didn't assume we had to do it their way. That wasn't genius. That was subtraction. Remove the noise. Remove the legacy. Remove the fear of sounding stupid. Then build. That's first principles. It's not innovation. It's clarity. And most people are terrified of clarity because clarity kills comfort. You see this everywhere. In education, in finance, in government. People defend bad systems because they're scared to admit how little they truly understand. They would rather sound smart inside a lie than admit they don't know what's real. But I'd rather be wrong from truth than right from tradition. That's why I question everything. Not to be difficult, but because the cost of lazy thinking is systemic failure. It's not optional, it's exponential. The longer you delay truth, the more it compounds against you. Every flawed assumption you refuse to challenge becomes a ceiling on what's possible. And most people never look up. That's the real danger. Not stupidity, but borrowed intelligence, memorized insight, recycled frameworks. You can't build the future with other people's maps. You have to burn them. You have to kill the version of you that finds safety in patterns, because the truth doesn't care how long you've believed the lie. It just waits. For the moment you're brave enough to stop pretending. I don't think like a businessman. I never have. I think like a physicist. Strip the problem down to its fundamentals. Remove the labels. Ignore what people call it. Ignore what people charge for it. Ignore what the market believes about it. Just ask, what is it made of? That's all physics is, a discipline of brutal honesty. And that's what most industries are missing. Honesty. They optimize around comfort. They build layers of complexity to hide the fact that they don't understand the core. But physics doesn't care about comfort. It only cares about truth. So when I face a problem, Whether it's rockets, cars, batteries, or brain interfaces, I don't start with the industry. I start with the physical reality. What are the inputs? What are the limits? What are the constraints of the laws of nature, not the constraints of your spreadsheet? That's how we built SpaceX. That's how we built Tesla. And that's how we'll build whatever comes next. Take energy density. Most people in the auto industry believed that electric cars could never replace gas. Too heavy, too slow, too expensive. They were reasoning by analogy, comparing new things to old things and assuming they had to work the same way. But physics doesn't care what you compare. It cares what you measure. I didn't ask, what have car companies done? I asked, what is the energy density of lithium-ion cells? What's the upper bound? What efficiency can we extract if we optimize thermal management, cell structure, and powertrain integration from scratch? That's not business. That's physics applied to systems. That's what most people miss. They think innovation is about adding features, making things shinier, more appealing. But real progress happens when you rebuild the foundation. And you can't do that unless you're willing to look stupid, to ask dumb questions, to challenge what no one else will touch. I've asked questions in rooms full of experts that made them uncomfortable. I've said things that made boardrooms fall silent. Not because I wanted to, but because someone had to be the one who wasn't afraid to say, wait, that doesn't make sense. In physics, there's no shame in not knowing. There's only shame in pretending. But business is the opposite. It rewards confidence, even if it's based on nothing. That's why so many companies die looking smart. Their confidence was built on metaphors, on borrowed language, on charts made to impress investors. But physics doesn't care about your deck. It cares about entropy. It cares about failure rates. It cares about what's real. So when I say we built rockets and cars by thinking like physicists, I don't mean we ran equations. I mean we asked, what is the system made of? What forces act on it? What constraints are fixed by nature? And which ones are just social fiction? That's how we broke cost barriers. That's how we reimagined supply chains. That's how we did what everyone said was impossible, not by being smarter, but by being more honest. If you can learn to think like that, not like a manager, not like a consultant, but like a physicist, then no problem stays unsolved for long. Because the truth is always simpler than the story people tell around it. It's not hard to learn something new. What's hard is killing what you thought was true. That's the real cost of thinking from first principles. It doesn't just challenge the world, it challenges you. Every assumption you inherited, every belief that made you feel smart, safe, respected, that has to go. And that's painful. Not because the truth hurts, but because the lie made you feel like someone. People build their identity around what they think they know. So when you start tearing that down, it's not just intellectual. It's surgical. I've had to do that more times than I can count. Dropping out of Stanford wasn't a statement. It was a realization. I didn't need credentials. I needed velocity. Stanford would have slowed me down. Not because it's bad, but because I wasn't there to follow. I was there to build. And building doesn't wait for permission. It starts with doubt. I've questioned everything: school, parenting, management, even friendship. Not to be cold, but because every system I was handed felt like it was designed to make me smaller, to fit me into someone else's blueprint. But I don't want to fit. I want to break, not to destroy, to rebuild, better, clearer, realer. Most people never do that. They optimize systems they didn't design. They protect beliefs they never chose. They live on autopilot and call it free will. That's not thinking. That's simulation. That's why I run my companies differently. At Tesla, we questioned every part in the car, every screw, every bracket, every process. What is this? Why does it exist? Can we remove it? If no one could prove it was essential, it was gone. That wasn't efficiency. That was epistemology. Don't keep things because they're there. Keep them because they withstand questioning. That's how I think about everything now. Even my own ideas. I've thrown away business models I created, scrapped designs I was proud of, changed my mind publicly. Not because I'm indecisive, but because I refuse to defend a version of myself that no longer holds up. Most people don't evolve. They just collect evidence that they were always right. I don't care about being right. I care about being real. And sometimes being real means burning your own playbook. It means admitting that what worked yesterday is holding you back today. That's not failure. That's adaptation. And most people can't do it because they've built too much of their identity on what they know. But the stronger your identity, the weaker your evolution. That's why I keep myself uncomfortable. That's why I surround myself with people who challenge me, who don't care who I am, only whether the logic works. Because that's all that matters, not who's speaking, not how it sounds, just whether it's true. That's the standard for everything. And if you're not willing to hold yourself to it, you can't expect the world to change. Because the world doesn't change from comfortable people, it changes from those willing to destroy themselves first. There's no magic to it, no hack, no secret sauce, just a process. Cold, precise, repeatable. People romanticize innovation like it's art. It's not. It's engineering, even when it's applied to ideas. The same way you'd break down a machine, I break down systems. 4 steps. Always 4. First, identify the real problem. Not the symptoms, not what people complain about, but the constraint, the friction. The immovable object behind the noise. If you get that wrong, everything else collapses. Most companies never solve anything because they're solving the wrong thing. Second, deconstruct to the raw parts. Strip the industry down to atoms. What are the fundamental components? Not the brand names, not the vendors, the physics, the materials, the actions required to make it work. If you don't know what it's made of, you can't reimagine it. Third, rebuild from zero, without reference, without borrowing. Forget how it's usually done. That's noise. That's inertia. Start from the physics. Start from cost per atom. Start from functional necessity, not tradition. Most people copy because it feels safe, but imitation is the enemy of truth. Fourth, iterate through hard logic. Don't fall in love with your solution. Brutally test it, stress it, make it fail, then rebuild it. Again and again. Not because it's wrong, but because it's fragile. And fragile things don't scale. That's it. That's the framework. I use it for rockets. I use it for cars. I use it for chips, tunnels, interfaces, factories. It works because it doesn't care about emotion. It cares about structure. Most people get stuck at step 1. They mistake the visible problem for the real one. They optimize symptoms. I look for constraints. That's why when Tesla couldn't scale, I didn't blame the car. I blamed the factory. The factory is the product. The supply chain is the algorithm. So we redesigned it. From the layout, to the robots, to the software that ran it all. Vertical integration wasn't a strategy. It was a necessity. Because the real problem wasn't the battery. It was the delay between every handoff, every outsourced decision, every layer of coordination. We cut the middle. We wrote new code. We moved faster. Not because we worked harder, but because we questioned harder. Same with batteries. The tabless cell wasn't a feature. It was a consequence of asking, what's the physics behind the heat transfer in traditional cells? What creates resistance? What can we change about the structure to reduce entropy? Not, what does Panasonic do? Not, what does the market expect? That's not how you lead. That's how you stay predictable. And predictable doesn't change the world. People think leadership is about charisma. It's not. It's about clarity, the kind that makes people uncomfortable, the kind that rips out the old wiring and forces the system to rebuild. You don't get that from consensus. You get it from first principles, from stepping outside the frame everyone else is stuck inside and refusing to return. That's the hard part, not the logic, the courage. Because once you see clearly, you can't unsee. You can't pretend the game isn't rigged. You can't pretend the process isn't broken. All you can do is rebuild, or lie to yourself. I choose the rebuild. Every time. Most people don't think. Not really. They simulate thinking. They rearrange familiar words. They cite familiar sources. They echo what sounds smart. But thinking, from first principles, is something else entirely. It's uncomfortable. It's slow. It's often lonely. And that's why almost no one does it. Because real thinking starts with admitting you don't know. And that's terrifying. Especially when the world rewards certainty. Especially when your identity is built around being seen as smart. Most people would rather be confidently wrong than vulnerably curious. They confuse confidence with clarity. But confidence is a costume. Clarity is a cut. It wounds first. Then it frees. That's why first principles thinking isn't popular. It doesn't make you feel good. It doesn't give you fast answers. It doesn't win debates. It makes you question the ground you're standing on, the tools you've always trusted, the story you tell yourself about how the world works. And that's dangerous, because when that story unravels, you have nothing to hold on to, except truth. And truth doesn't comfort. It corrects. The system doesn't teach us to think like this. It teaches us to memorize, to comply, to perform. School doesn't reward you for questioning the test. It rewards you for giving the answer they expect. That's where it starts. You become addicted to recognition, to being right, not because you are, but because you played the game well. And by the time you leave the system, your mind has been trained to avoid discomfort. You follow authority. You avoid doubt. You use the same models as everyone else and call it best practice. But best practice is just a polished assumption, a collective habit. And habits aren't truth. They're shortcuts, mental macros, useful, until they're not. Until the world changes, until the complexity overwhelms the script. That's when most people freeze, not because they're weak, but because they were never taught how to think without a script. They're brilliant at following, but useless when the path disappears. That's the crisis, not stupidity, not laziness. Dependence, intellectual dependence, on institutions, on tradition, on past success. People aren't dumb. They're domesticated. Trained to obey the dominant logic, trained to believe what their tribe believes, because standing alone is terrifying, especially when everyone around you is nodding in sync. That's why consensus is dangerous. It doesn't mean you're right. It just means you're synchronized. But truth doesn't care how many people believe it. It only cares whether it holds up under pressure. Most people never test their beliefs under pressure. They protect them. They defend them. They attach their ego to them. So when you question the belief, you're not just questioning an idea. You're attacking their identity. And they fight back. Not with logic, with emotion, with tribalism, with shame. That's how the system polices thought. Not with facts, but with fear. The fear of looking dumb. The fear of standing alone. The fear of being wrong. But here's the paradox. You can't become original without being wrong first. You can't lead without unlearning. You can't break ground without breaking comfort. That's why most people never do it. Not because they can't, but because they won't. Because they'd rather feel safe in fiction than exposed in truth. And until that changes, the future will keep being built by the few who are willing to go there alone. Thinking from first principles alone is hard. Doing it with a team is harder. Because now it's not just your assumptions you have to kill, it's theirs. And people protect their assumptions like territory, especially when their identity, their salary, their sense of competence is attached to them. That's why most companies don't scale clarity. They scale comfort. They build hierarchies, meetings, rituals, systems designed to preserve existing logic, not question it. That's not how I operate. At SpaceX, at Tesla, at Neuralink, anyone can question anything. I don't care about your title. I care about your logic. I've told interns to challenge VPs. I've told engineers to delete legacy code written by people with more degrees than they have years on Earth. Not because it's disrespectful, but because the mission matters more than your ego. If someone can't defend an idea under scrutiny, it doesn't belong in the system. Simple. That's not a culture of disrespect. It's a culture of reality. And reality doesn't care how long you've worked here. It only cares whether your idea makes sense. Most companies punish that. They punish friction. They protect hierarchy. They build processes that reward obedience. But obedience is the enemy of innovation. You can't build the future if people are afraid to ask dumb questions. You can't move fast if people need permission to think. So we tear that out. Ruthlessly. We remove layers. We collapse reporting lines. We remove rules that no one can explain. We delete meetings that exist out of habit. The test is simple. Why does this exist? If no one can answer with clarity, it's gone. Not next quarter. Now. That's how you keep a system alive, by letting it self-correct constantly. Not through bureaucracy, through reasoning, through pressure testing every part, like you would pressure test a rocket. That's why even my time isn't sacred. If I make a decision and someone down the chain has better logic, I expect to be challenged. I demand it. Because I'm not trying to be right. I'm trying to be accurate. And accuracy doesn't care who's talking. That's the kind of culture most people say they want, but almost no one is willing to live inside. Because it's uncomfortable. Because it exposes weakness. Because it forces everyone to think. And thinking is expensive. Thinking is threatening. Thinking doesn't scale easily. But it's the only thing that works when the world keeps changing. That's why we train for it. We don't just hire smart people. We hire people who can kill their own ideas. Who can separate ego from outcome. Who can say, I was wrong, without falling apart. That's rare. And it's why so few companies make it past iteration 1. They build something, they celebrate, then they freeze. They protect what they built. But what you build is temporary. What you need is a system that keeps building. That's what first principles gives you. Not a product, but a process. A process that doesn't care about legacy. A process that doesn't need permission. A process that can run without a manual. Because it's wired for truth. Most organizations aren't wired for truth. They're wired for stability. But truth isn't stable. It's dynamic. It evolves. It demands that you rebuild. Every day. Not just when it's convenient. That's why most people quit. That's why they say it's too hard. Not because it's impossible, but because it never stops. And they want it to stop. But the system I'm building doesn't stop. It doesn't wait. It doesn't flatter you. It forces you to think. Like a physicist. Like a builder. Like someone who doesn't accept that the way things are is the way they have to be. That's how you scale truth. Not by adding more people, but by removing more excuses. They said it couldn't be done. Not because of physics, but because of history. Because no one had done it before. Because all the charts, all the models, all the minds agreed. It was too ambitious, too expensive, too risky. That's how impossible is usually defined. Not by nature, but by consensus. Starship wasn't built to impress. It was built to break that consensus, to show that when you strip away tradition, assumption, fear, what's left is raw potential. I didn't ask, can we build a rocket this big? I asked, what's the cheapest way to get a kilogram to orbit? That's the real question. That's first principles. Mass, gravity, thrust, materials, failure tolerance, thermal loads, reusability. How much does it cost to move a payload from Earth to space, not according to tradition, but according to physics? That's where Starship came from. Not a dream, a deduction. And that's why people called it crazy. Because it didn't look like anything else. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't polished. It exploded, publicly, repeatedly. But that wasn't failure. That was data. That was speed. That was iteration at a scale the old aerospace world couldn't emotionally tolerate. Because in their world, a single test failure was a scandal. In mine, it's a step. I'd rather blow up 100 prototypes than believe in one elegant lie. That's what most people don't understand. They think impossible is a wall. It's not. It's a fog. And the only way through fog is motion. That's why I don't wait until something is perfect. I build it. I break it. I build it again. I move. Because movement reveals truth. Paper hides it. And when the truth emerges, when the numbers align, when the math says it's possible, you commit fully, publicly, without apology. That's what we did with stainless steel. People laughed, said it was outdated, said it was heavy, but they didn't ask. What happens to heat dissipation at scale? What happens to cost per ton when you stop caring about polish and start caring about performance? They saw steel. I saw survival. I saw a rocket that could land, relaunch, and endure. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. That's not science fiction. That's subtraction. Subtract what you don't need. Subtract what doesn't stand up to physics. Subtract the idea that looking smart matters more than being right. And what you're left with is a solution no one else saw. That's how you rebuild the impossible. Not by dreaming harder, but by thinking cleaner. By doing the math others are too proud or too afraid to run. Because the truth is, impossible isn't a fact. It's a ceiling made of inherited assumptions. And if you're willing to break those assumptions, to tear down the ceiling with your own hands, what you find isn't madness. It's freedom. The greatest threat to progress isn't failure. It's lazy thinking. Failure teaches. Laziness delays. And delay is death. Slow, invisible, self-inflicted. Most people aren't blocked by external obstacles. They're trapped by internal shortcuts. They default to assumptions, to analogies, to best practices that haven't been questioned in decades. And they call it logic. But it's not logic. It's imitation. Polished, packaged, recycled. Lazy thinking looks like intelligence from a distance. It uses complex language, impressive models. But underneath, it's hollow. It avoids fundamentals. It avoids friction. It seeks answers that feel good, not ones that hold up under pressure. That's how systems rot. Not from crisis, from comfort. From people who stopped asking why because it made them look uncertain, because it made meetings awkward, because it exposed how little anyone actually understands. Lazy thinking doesn't look evil. It looks efficient. It hides in templates. It hides in bullet points. It hides in consensus. And it spreads, quietly, until everyone in the room is nodding along and no one's thinking. That's why I hate buzzwords. They're shields. Language designed to sound smart while preventing clarity, synergy, disruption, scalability, innovation. All placeholders for, we haven't thought deeply about this yet. Real thinking has no buzzwords. It has questions, sharp ones, uncomfortable ones. What are we actually trying to solve? What would this look like if we started from scratch? Is this true or just familiar? Those are the questions that break illusions. That's why people avoid them. They'd rather sound smart than be right. They'd rather move fast than move well. They'd rather be safe in a system that's failing than exposed in one that's working. But a fragile truth is better than a beautiful lie. That's the standard. For everything I build, for every decision I make. If an idea can't survive first principles, it doesn't deserve to live. And if a team can't question itself, it doesn't deserve to scale. That's not cruelty. That's coherence. That's how nature works. Nature doesn't reward potential. It rewards performance. It doesn't care about your plan. It cares if it works. That's why physics is my filter. Not trends, not tradition, not credentials, just laws that don't flinch when you push on them. That's what lazy thinking can't handle. It collapses under pressure. It retreats to reputation. It blames the market, the user, the timing. Anything but its own logic. But the future won't be built by those who blame. It will be built by those who question, who discard what doesn't hold, who rebuild without permission, who are willing to look dumb in rooms full of people faking certainty. Because certainty is cheap. But clarity, that's rare. And it's clarity that moves us forward. Not noise, not branding, not applause. Just truth. Earned, understood, applied, ruthlessly. Every time I start something new, I pretend I know nothing. Not because I'm humble, but because knowing is dangerous. It creates blind spots. It makes you trust your memory instead of the moment. It makes you repeat what worked instead of asking what's true. That's why I unlearn. Every project, every phase, every day. I erase before I build. Because if I don't, the past writes the present. And if the present is written by the past, there's no room for the future. Most people live inside a script they didn't write. They inherit beliefs. They inherit fears. They inherit limits. And then they call it personality. But personality isn't fixed. It's a process. Just like thinking. Just like progress. So, I treat myself like I treat every system. Break it down. Question every part. Challenge every habit. Ask, does this serve the mission? If not, I discard it. Thought, behavior, identity. I don't care how long it's been there. I care whether it belongs now. That's how you stay alive. That's how you keep evolving. Not by growing bigger, but by staying honest. First principles isn't just how I build companies. It's how I build clarity, how I make decisions, how I raise my kids, how I rebuild when things collapse. It's not about being right. It's about being free. Free to think. Free to act. Free to start again without dragging your old self with you. That's the real cost of innovation. You don't just kill assumptions. You kill your attachment to being who you were. That's hard, but it's necessary, because every breakthrough begins with a burial. Of the old logic, of the old language, of the old image you had of yourself. People think progress is about gaining. It's not. It's about letting go. And letting go hurts, but not as much as staying stuck. I've had to walk away from things that mattered, ideas I loved, teams I built, even versions of me that the world admired, not because they were bad, but because they were done, useful once, obsolete now. And the longer you cling, the heavier you become, until the weight of who you were keeps you from becoming who you could be. So I begin again, not once, not twice, always. That's the engine. Not inspiration, not vision boards. Just the willingness to start from zero, again and again, like a scientist, like a builder, like a mind that doesn't need certainty to move. Because certainty is slow, but motion reveals clarity. And clarity, earned, not inherited, is how you rebuild a life. Not from ambition, from alignment. Not from what looks right, from what is right. Even if no one else sees it yet. Even if you don't have all the words for it. Even if it feels like walking off the edge. That's where progress begins. In the silence. In the space where the old story ends and nothing has replaced it yet. Most people fear that space. I live there. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's real. And in that reality, there's no map. no script, just a question. What is true now? Answer that, and begin again. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. Most people stop at answers. You kept going. To questions that challenge your identity, to truths that don't trend well, to a way of thinking most never dare to touch. But that's how it starts. That's how systems get rewritten. Not with noise, not with hype, but with clarity. If this video sparked something real, don't let it fade. Subscribe to Mind of Musk to go deeper. This isn't just content. It's a blueprint for rebuilding your logic, one question at a time. And when you're ready to go further, watch the next video. Or, better, watch this one. Because the first time, you listened. But the second time, you'll hear yourself differently.